Hi, everybody. For those just signing on, we're just going to give it another minute or two for everybody to have a chance to sign in, and then we will get started with our evening. All right, well, I think I will go ahead and get going with some intros because I know we have a lot of stuff that we want to talk about and only 90 minutes for it. So we'll go ahead and dive in. So I wanted to thank you all for being here. Good evening, good morning, good middle of the night, depending on where you're joining us from. And thank you so much for joining us for the Wikimedia Foundation's annual summer panel. Wikimedia is, of course, the nonprofit organization that supports Wikipedia and other free knowledge projects. And the Wikimedia Foundation's legal team regularly hosts a number of legal fellows who are current law students or recent graduates. And every summer, one of the things that our fellows takes on is the organization of one of these panels. So you'll see this year's fellows in the chat. That's Lisa Chen, Mary Bagdasarian, David Afahame, sorry, David, and George Chen. I am not one of the fellows. My name is Leanna Mixter, and I am lead counsel at the Wikimedia Foundation, and I'm going to be your moderator for this discussion on content moderation. Wikimedia has a pretty small legal team, so like all of us, I wear a number of hats, but the most relevant one for today's panel is that I work on our content moderation portfolio, keeping an eye on the ongoing legal risks to Wikipedia content. So as part of that work, I've had the opportunity to work with a couple of today's panelists, and I'm delighted to get to meet some of the rest. We truly have an all-star panel here today. So without further ado, I would like to introduce our panelists. So up first, we've got Alex Abdo, who is the litigation director at the Knight First Amendment Institute at Columbia University. Alex has been particularly involved in the Institute's groundbreaking challenge to the constitutionality of former President Donald Trump's blocking of critics from his @RealDonaldTrump Twitter account, and in the Institute's challenge to the constitutionality of the NSA's program of upstream surveillance, which is something that is near and dear to our hearts at Wikimedia. Next up, we have Titi Akinsame, who works with Google as their lead for public policy and government relations in West and Francophone Africa. Titi has also served as a Berkman Klein Fellow and previously worked with the World Economic Forum's Global Future Council on Digital Economy and the WEF's Strategy and Advisory Team on Digital Identity. Next up, we have Emila Gandhi, who works with Facebook as their Stakeholder Engagement Manager for Europe, the Middle East, and Africa. Emila is Emula's current policy issues include safety and security, privacy, internet shutdowns, freedom of expression, regulation, and public sector use of social media. Prior to Facebook, Emila was Africa Policy Coordinator for the Association for Progressive Communications. Next, we have David Kaye, who is the University of California Irvine Professor of Law and former United Nations Special Rapporteur for Freedom of Expression. During his work with the UN, David was the global body's principal monitor for freedom of expression issues worldwide. Some of his recent work for the UN included reporting on COVID-19 and freedom of expression, as well as online hate speech. And last but certainly not least, we have Tiffany Lee, who is an associate professor of law at the University of New Hampshire, where she teaches internet law and constitutional law. She is also a fellow at the Yale Law School's Information Society Project and a former Wikimedia Foundation legal fellow as well. So thank you all so much for being here this evening. I think we're going to have a great discussion. So before we begin, any questions for me before I dive into some of these questions? All right, well then we're going to go right into it. So we're going to have about an hour-long discussion. We have three major topics that I'm hoping we'll cover this evening. We'll spend about 20 minutes on each of them, and then there's going to be a 15-minute Q&A session with the audience. So for our audience, please feel free to submit questions in the Q&A or in the chat. And our fellows are going to be keeping an eye on those, sending those questions to me to pose to our panelists. So please feel free to chime in with any questions you might have for them. So our first topic is recent developments in content moderation of online platforms, and particularly as public officials increasingly use online platforms as an extension of their office, should their online speech be treated differently than their offline speech? And not to put you on the spot, Alex, but I think since this is something that you spent a lot of time thinking about, I would be really interested to hear what you have to say.
Yeah, thanks, Lana, and thanks so much for inviting me. It's a delight to be here, especially among such a fantastic group of panelists. I'm honored to be among them. So I think there are really two questions here, or really, two separate issues that are worth thinking through. The first is, should the accounts of public officials be treated specially under law? And this is the question that our litigation against former President Trump was meant to get at. When public officials take their speech online and use their social media accounts as extensions of their office, what does the First Amendment have to say about the way in which they use their accounts? And I'm sure much of the audience will remember that President Trump used his account prolifically, but also in a kind of fairly petty way. He would block critics from the comment threads. He would apparently, according to a document he filed in our litigation against him, he himself would personally block critics and those who expressed viewpoints that he didn't agree with. And the question that we were trying to get a court to rule on was whether that violated the First Amendment. Did his use of his account reflect the action of the state, such that the First Amendment, which applies generally only to state actors, limit his ability to do that? And the courts ended up agreeing with us. The Supreme Court never got a chance to rule on the question because the case had become moot by the time it got up that high, because Twitter had kicked him off the platform, and of course he was voted out of office. But the lower court sided with us and held that when politicians use their social media accounts as extensions of their office, the First Amendment limits their ability to kick out people who disagree with them. And that seems to be now the emerging consensus amongst the lower courts in the United States. That principle. It hasn't yet been resolved by the Supreme Court, but we've even seen it in some other courts around the world who have come to similar rulings. I don't know the full extent of that. Maybe David does, or others on the call. The second issue I think that's worth thinking through is whether the platforms should treat public officials differently. So this is quite distinct from the question of whether the law treats them differently when they go online. Should the platforms treat them differently? And I don't think there's one answer to this question, but I think there are two principles that inform at least the way that I think about it. The first is that the public interest in the speech of politicians is high. It matters to the public and to voters and to civil society what politicians say, especially when they're talking about their duties in office and the problems of the day, and even when they're saying repugnant things. There is a public interest in being able to see what the politicians say. The second principle is that speech on social media by politicians in particular appears to have a greater capacity for harm, at least in some circumstances. And the way platforms think about speech of politicians should also reflect that reality. They should account for the fact that politicians, with the megaphone that social media gives them, and with the particular functionality of social media, namely its ability to amplify and also to galvanize or polarize, those on our platforms, they should develop policies that account for that fact. And I said, I think, as I said before, there's not one answer to what that means for platform policies. There's a lot of room for different approaches, and we'll talk about those, I think, when we get to the second topic, which is, potential solutions. But To my mind, those are the two, principles that any social media moderation policies from the platform should reflect.
So I can jump in. I think that's a great way to summarize the issues. And I'm really interested, for me, coming from a non-litigation standpoint, in that second half of your answer, talking about whether or not companies should treat these accounts differently. And I think that's really interesting on a global stage, right? Because we see other national leaders that sometimes have accounts taken down very quickly without much explanation. Now there's some explanation, but in the past, at least, without much explanation. So I think there's also some transparency issues there, where people are seeing different treatment for, say, the US national leader spouting off, ridiculous things that are harmful to democracy versus some other nations. And I think that's an interesting question. It's not my necessary expertise, but I love to hear others who worked on that as well. I think it's important to remember the global context.
Yeah, maybe I'll jump in with that. I feel like that was you were sort of calling my name, Tiffany, but that was great. Both of your points and Alex's, I think, are really excellent framing for the kinds of issues, and I think in particular, what's interesting in this space is that you have legal issues. What does the First Amendment say about speech, and the ability of government officials to block, viewers and participants in whether we call it a public square or not, in public debate. And then we have, the role of companies and the responsibilities of companies, particularly in areas where companies have this, massive discretion to decide, at least as a matter of law, to decide what the rules are. And I think that's very interesting. And to me, one of the, if we're talking about content moderation issues that are very current, it's this kind of clash between cultures, almost a culture of legal requirement on the one hand and discretion on the other. And we have two different arguments or two different debates taking place almost in real time. They're happening in parallel, and sometimes people get a little bit confused by that, right? Because people, I think, certainly in the United States, understand that the government has, certain constraints as a matter of law, and then they import those over into what, Facebook or Twitter or YouTube are also required to do, and that's something totally different. And I think, to sort of tee off on what Tiffany was suggesting, I think that same kind of uncertainty that we see in the debate in the United States is also a part of the global debate. And I think the way we see that, and maybe some of the issues that we'll talk about also in our second topic when we get to models, is that it's important to recognize that the company decisions around content moderation are taking place in an increasingly pressurized environment. Sometimes it's public pressure. Sometimes it's the government of Nigeria blocking Twitter entirely in Nigeria, and maybe Titi will talk a little bit about that as well from the sort of on the West African perspective. You see this in India as well, government really imposing very draconian rules in order to get companies to adopt certain content moderation perspectives. And then you also see in Europe, a kind of, more, I would say, rule of law oriented, well-considered approach to thinking about what content moderation should look like, what transparency, as Tiffany was suggesting, what that should look like. So I think, I apologize for the kind of rambling nature of my intervention here, but I think Alex and Tiffany sparked a lot of different pathways for this discussion. And I think sort of thinking about content moderation only as a company issue and without the pressure of the government and the public that would miss a big part of it. And I'm glad that Alex and Tiffany kind of combined those two in our discussion already.
Thanks. I feel like I gotta go next since you mentioned me. So first off, thank you. I'm really, really happy to be here. It's kind of late for me as well, but I would not have missed it. There are two ways this could go about. I'm here speaking on behalf of Google, but you can attribute all the misspeaks to me as a person. I've been doing this for 20 years, so feel free. I love a really good conversation. So the first thing I'll start off with is, as Google, as a rule, our approach is not to moderate for personalities, but for content, because then you can be a lot more equitable in your delivery. Now, we've always advocated for, for the longest time for, free and open web, etc. But it's not enough. Personally and professionally, I don't think it's enough, because we all know we need to do better, right? We need to be able to think about safety, inclusivity, empowerment, and a range of other core values, which I think you have inferred in various ways. A part of me coming to this conversation thought, is this going to be America-centric? Are we going to spend the entirety of the time talking about the ban of Trump? Or are we going to be able to look at this holistically with the fact that this is a global conversation that has very nuances to it based on the local laws, the cultures, and the powers that they carry, right? And in that way, for us as Google, our work continues to be very much focused around certain standards that can be applied irrespective of the location. Now, in some cases, that might mean that it's applied almost immediately. In others, it takes a bit of a longer time. But I'm happy to talk about that in more detail later when we get to the other questions. But overall, a re-emphasis, free and open, keeping in mind safety, inclusivity, the power that you carry based on, your role, not just your personality. And at the core of it, ensuring that we can have content moderation that is applicable across board, irrespective of who you are. The same way we fight for equity, it's the same way we should be approaching content moderation. I'll hand it back to whoever wants to go next.
I'll go. So thank you so much for inviting us and for inviting me here. And hello from London. I will not switch on my video lest my image is shared on Facebook. It's very early in London, or late if you want to say that way. So thank you so much for all these insights. I agree with what David, Tiffany, Alex, Titi are saying, and I would say I think regardless of the medium through which public figures or public officials are expressing themselves. So whether it's your old, like print newspaper, whether it's radio, or they decide to, to use Facebook, I think speech should, be treated the same. But when it comes to public officials, I mean, I do, of course, acknowledge the reach, the power that these public officials have, and also acknowledge what David said and Alex about the public interest and the interest that people have and the voters have in the officials as well. They've significantly expanded their potential reach, their power, using platforms, amplified their voices as well. But our approach, at Facebook reflects the way we try to balance the values of free expression and safety, and our community standards, the content policies themselves are applicable to everyone who uses our platforms. What we've done recently, and we've talked to some of you, I've seen some of the participants here, was to try to relook or relook at how we define public figures. Who are these public figures? Who can be in that category? How can we classify them? What characters and characteristics do we need to look at? And we received so much feedback. I'm in the stakeholder engagement team where we talk to different experts to gather insights and feedback into how we build our community standards. And there was this overwhelming piece of feedback that we got, that international human rights law and standards, they protect political speech at the highest level. But such speech should be tested for proportionality, and also assessed regarding, the public figures themselves, looking also at their reach, and the jurisdiction in which they are in. So there's been a lot that we've heard, also including, that there's always trade-off between, being a platform for free expression in how, like what I've said in the beginning, but also trying to keep people safe. It's a difficult balance to strike, especially in high stakes situations like elections. But going back to the question of, whether online speech should be treated differently than offline speech, it's a complex, I think it's a complex discussion and a very difficult discussion, but I think that's why we are here to discuss that.
I just throw in, one observation, and I'm not sure, Leanna, if this is getting toward potential solutions, but just because I just want to, I guess, agree with this, something that Emilara said, which is, that we ought to think through these questions through a lens of proportionality, and I agree with that, and I guess to my mind, that principle should apply not just at the level of the question of whether speech should be allowed on a platform or should not be allowed on a platform, or whether individuals should be allowed on a platform or not, but also when it comes to the range of responses that platforms might have to pick particular speech. So, for example, I mentioned earlier the public interest that there may be in speech by politicians, elected officials, even if it's repugnant, maybe especially when it's repugnant speech. The public interest in access to that speech could be served in a variety of ways that do not need to include algorithmic amplification and delivery of that speech on the platform. It could be, the public interest in it could be served by basic access, the ability to access that speech in a cordoned off, spot on the platform, or behind, a click-through, that is not amplified in the way that other speech on the platform is. And that kind of experimentation, it'd be exciting to see more experimentation of that sort by the platforms in their content moderation policies. And we haven't seen a terrible amount. We've seen, more experimentation at the level of what speech is allowed and what speech isn't, what speech you're going to check, fact check, and what speech you're not going to fact check. I think we've seen comparatively less. We've seen some, for sure, experimentation on labeling and, efforts to introduce friction in the spread of, hateful or other kinds of harmful speech. But not all that much. And one reason we haven't seen a ton is just because there's not a whole lot of competition in the social media world. And that's another thing I think we can talk about when we get to solutions, is how to introduce more competition so that we may see more experimentation. But it'd be great to see that kind of experimentation. And I wonder, for TT and Emilara, and apologize that you'll be you're the platform representatives, but it's great that you're here for that reason. I wonder how you think about that sort of experimentation, and whether it's something that is considered by the platforms more. I mean, I know both of yours have done some experimentation in that regard, but is there room for more? Is it being considered?
I'd be happy to come in first. Is there always room for more? There is always room for more innovation. And are we in support of innovation, of thinking through what could work in a collaborative way across the ecosystem? Absolutely. Currently, a lot of what we do when it comes to content moderation use, 4 key R words: remove, raise, reduce, reward. And those are things that we have applied over time, and we have seen that works. But increasingly, the more free expression that happens, the more we see content being shared and being extrapolated, the more we realize that it's not a responsibility that can just sit with us as the platforms. Certainly not. But we are willing to work. We're willing to collaborate. If there is opportunity for competition, I will say this professionally and personally, I think Google is one of the institutions that has demonstrated their willingness to be able to enable competition. Now, that is debatable in some markets, but certainly one of the best ways I see it described is we're best in class at what we do, but does not translate that we are perfect in class in what we do. And that's why, for me, it's an iterative learning opportunity to be able to work with what we have in place, but more importantly, have room to be able to dialogue right? To walk through what would work in different circumstances. And I will say that particularly over the last year, when majority of the world has been stuck behind the screens, we've had an opportunity to see more interesting ways of being able to address content. I'd like to pass it on again. I'm not sure if anybody wants to come back. I can keep talking if you want me to, though.
Maybe oh, Tiffany, you go first.
Sure. I actually wanted to bring up, Alex, you were talking about the lack of competition. And I think, in the US, I would say so, but that's not necessarily true abroad, right? Especially in countries with more localized internet. And I'm obviously thinking right now about China. And, the social media landscape there is it's almost completely divorced from what we have in the US and, much of the world. But, millions of users, huge user base, and interesting implications, right? So many people around the world are using TikTok now, for example. And the content moderation practices on TikTok, I think, are quite different than what we've seen with, I'd say, Facebook or Google or Twitter or so on. And that's an interesting thing to think about, because if we're thinking about, just having more competition be the solution, I think we have to consider the international context again, which I know we're all talking about. But we do have to consider that content moderation isn't just something that will help, one company in the US, one company in Europe, but ideally there'll become some sort of norm about speech moderation. And if the companies and, civil society can come together, as we've tried in the past, we can ideally create future speech norms that are more, pro-openness, pro-free speech, and so on. I think that's even more important, considering that some of the competitors, the new tech competitors, might not be coming out of the same countries that we might expect them to be coming out.
Amila, as our other platform representative, I saw for a moment there that you had unmuted, so I wanted to make sure you had a chance to respond if you wanted to.
Yes, so quickly, I think on innovation, what we are really emphasizing is the participation of stakeholders. So ensuring that stakeholders are actually included in not only providing feedback, but also in ensuring that we get to where we want to land in terms of our community standards. But we also recognize, one thing that we are doing now in terms of our stakeholder engagement is ensuring that we are as inclusive as possible, because as the majority of the people who use our platforms are outside of the US. How can we ensure that even our content moderation processes reflect that? It cannot just happen out of the blue. We have to be intentional, being very intentional by ensuring that, the broadest and most diverse range of stakeholders meaningfully participate in our policy development processes. But for that to happen, we also, I come from civil society, background. We recognize that there is a power imbalance, between Facebook and external stakeholders, and even across different external stakeholders. What can we do to ensure that these stakeholders actually participate and influence our community standards? It's difficult for that to happen if you are in, we want to talk to academics probably in South Africa and there is an internet shutdown, for example, or there is a power cut. What can we do to make sure that these voices are heard in our community standards? Because community standards themselves are part and parcel of content moderation as well. I think I'll stop there. I think David wanted to say something before I jumped in.
No, that was great. Emilar, I actually want to take off from your comment, because it kind of connects to where Alex started this particular thread and where Titi and Tiffany have gone as well. And it's the point that you raised that I think is really meaningful to me is, what's the capacity of the platforms to actually get access to the communities where they are so dominant, so that they can make the decisions around, say, amplification or not. Because, I mean, I think it's important to remember that the platforms have all sorts of tools to deal with amplification, with, you know, kind of quarantining particular content, as Alex was suggesting, and other steps maybe to slow down or moderate the virality of certain kind of content. But even doing that requires the platforms to know which specific content to apply those rules or those technologies to. And I think it's not always clear to me that the platforms, you know, as much as the platforms have tens of thousands of moderators around the world, that they really have access to communities in order to do that kind of work. To say, oh, this is content that may raise issues of incitement to violence or incitement to hatred and discrimination, but it's coming from a public figure, so we're not going to delete it, but we're going to somehow, you know, put it into this particular, you know, quadrant, and people will be able to get access to it, but it won't have the same virality. But you still have to make that substantive call about the content itself. And I'd be interested in hearing, you know, whether people think that the platforms, you know, genuinely have the tools, which ultimately are human resources, to get access to that kind of content and make those kinds of decisions.
I think that pretty naturally segues us into our sort of next topic, which is planning to talk about solutions. So this is something that I personally am concerned about, you know, in particular, given, you know, as legal counsel for Wikipedia, Wikipedia's way of doing things is very community focused. It is not the same as how Facebook or Twitter or Google or YouTube might approach content moderation. So given that different online platforms have different content moderation models tailored to their needs, what should those models look like? How can these solutions carry forward?
I'm happy to, you know, jump in unless someone else wants us to start off. But just to pick up on a theme that I started a minute ago, you know, I'd like to see more diversity in the online speech environment. And you know, one way I think about this, and I'll apologize for drawing on my biology background. I was a, you know, biology major in college, and ever since have tried to see the world through natural selection. But one thing that you learn in when you study biology is that a reason why we have sexual reproduction as humans as opposed to asexual reproduction is to increase genetic diversity, because genetic diversity limits the viral spread of disease, because a population that is genetically diverse is less likely to be susceptible to the viral spread of disease. And I think the same is true by analogy in an online speech environment. When you have an online speech environment that is governed by just a small handful of machine learning systems that decide what speech is seen and what speech is not, it is terribly unsurprising that we are witnessing the viral spread of misinformation and the viral spread of hate and other, you know, forms of harmful speech. And I suspect that if we had a more heterogeneous environment, you know, a more diverse set of algorithms deciding what speech we heard and what speech we didn't, that we would see less viral spread of some of these things. I have, you know, I'm not at all convinced that it, you know, having a more diverse environment would solve these problems, but I think it would mitigate them, and I think it would allow for the possibility of competition and experimentation and innovation, to use CT's word, that, you know, might give us new insights into how we should structure our online speech environment. And you know, to David's point a minute ago, it may be that you know, global behemoths simply can't be responsive to local communities in the way we want them to be. It may be that we have to have infrastructure designed from the ground up with community interests in mind, more responsive by virtue of their you know, localization to community norms than, you know, may be possible with, you know, companies as large as some of the ones that we have. Now, that's all speculation. Who knows? We don't know. But you it's hard to find out given the current state that we're in. And there are some alternative models that at least are, give reason for hope. One is Wikimedia, which is a absolutely shocking experiment in how a community can work. And it's stunning that it works the way it works. And another is a little discussed social media platform called Mastodon, which is a federated social media platform that has different communities that model different interoperable spaces for discussion. And, has, I think, about 2 million users last time I looked into it. And it's obviously tiny in comparison, but as communities that are responsive in different ways, maybe than Google and Facebook and Twitter and TikTok can be. So that's just a pitch for experimentation, and competition.
I'll lean in and I'll start off with this, that overall online content moderation is an innovation race. I think we are all in agreement with that. And a part of the conversation that I haven't heard today is that even as platforms consistently, we as platforms, right, consistently look to innovate and improve on our ability to be able to moderate content in a way that ensures our policies and our guidelines, our community policies and guidelines are not broken. As we are running the race to innovate, so are those, and we improve our defenses, so are those individuals, groups, who use our services with the intent to create these harms. They are also innovating, right? And this is very much the fact when it comes to misinformation, think conspiracy theorists, anti-vaxxers, political leadership, consistently adapting their knowledge of and use of technology to circumvent many of the innovative rules, innovative approaches that we're putting in place. Now, for us, at the very least, part of what we do currently is first having an understanding of what a person's purpose, a user's purpose is, before we determine whether or not the piece of content is beneficial or if it's broken a rule. So I mentioned earlier, local context matters. It's not always a US-centric approach. Definitely agree with you about the need to be able to have an increased diversity in humans who are actually reviewing content, who are identifying the trends, and who are able to give that local flavor. You were referring to your biological background. I love food, so I'm going to refer to my love of food. That hint of, whether it's oregano or something, that completely either sets it apart in a positive way, or, something's gone completely off. And of course, also working to ensure that the algorithms that we have in place actually are reviewing things in a way that is not biased, right? So putting all of that in mind, the key in terms of whatever approaches are being suggested beyond what we are currently actively invested in doing is that there needs to be transparency, it needs to be fair, and there have to be effective processes to address these behaviors. And to emphasize, I think my last statement for this section is that these rules are global, but the applicability is very much localized.
Oh, go ahead, MLR.
Okay, I wanted to actually, thanks Titi for that. I wanted to go back to your question, David, about whether, platforms actually do have the capacity, to reach these stakeholders or users or people who use the platforms who are spread across, the world. And I think I know we are focusing a lot on the reviewers, the content reviewers, but I think it goes beyond that. So and how we've approached it even at Facebook is not just looking at the reviewers themselves. Of course, they play a very, very important role, But our content moderation, takes, three ways. So one obviously is the content policy team, the team that I am in, that the one that develops and refines the community standards and talking to external experts, academics, and all that. But also then there is the community integrity team, and this one is the one that builds the products, to keep people safe and secure, developing the artificial intelligence algorithms that detect and surface the harmful content. And the global operations team is where, we have these reviewers. But in terms of actually the capacity to reach out to different people, I'll give you examples of what my team does. Whenever we have a policy that we are developing or refining or re-looking at, we make sure that we talk to external people. Do we talk to everyone? Of course not. We do not have that capacity to talk to everyone, but we bucket, the different stakeholders. So academics, civil society organizations, youth, depending on what policy it is. So we ensure that we talk to different stakeholders that are relevant to the policy. But I wanted to also highlight one thing, which is capacity. Not our own capacity as a platform, but capacity of the people sometimes that we talk to, because I think for the stakeholders themselves to meaningfully engage and contribute to the policy development, they need to be to be knowledgeable about the policy that we want to talk about. And I know quite a number of civil society organizations that are running capacity building programs, and also maybe giving kudos to Google as well. I know they're running a program with University of Pretoria on some of these issues as well. So ensuring, that innovation is important and all that, but if we are not making sure that some of the stakeholders, or some of the stakeholders that we are engaging are knowledgeable in the in the issues that we are talking about, then it will just be a matter of ticking boxes that, we've talked to so and so, but do they actually know what they're talking about? So that's one thing. Then the second thing is, beyond the reviewers, I think it's also important to hire with a diversity approach as well. And what I mean by that, ensuring that, we have a diverse workforce. So engineers themselves, people who make decisions, leaders at the company, because, decisions are made at a certain level, and we need to just ensure also that, our workforce is as diverse, to represent also the people that we that use our platform.
I want to just sort of plus one this last point that Emlar made, and it's the issue of diversity isn't maybe how many of us think about it in terms of either educational or workplace environments. The policy making, and for the highest profile cases, if we want to call them that, the highest profile controversies, those decisions are often made by a very small number of people. Generally speaking, they're in a pretty specific geographic space in Northern California. I myself am a California snob, so it's not the California part that is a problem. But there is a clear problem. It's certainly at the working level, but it's also at the leadership level. Where are people drawn from? What is their experience? What is their sensitivity to different kinds of rules and rulemaking that might take place around the world? And I think that diversity is really important. So, Emila, I'm glad you raised that, because it really is. It's across the industry, and it's also not just maybe a certain kind of diversity. It's also diversity of of work experience and so forth. So I think that's a really important point. I mean, the other point that I wanted to make that might be bleeding over into our third topic is, I think it's really valuable to have diversity in the way companies treat these different issues. And of course, that will be enhanced by competition in this space. And the dominance of a few platforms doesn't help that. I think that, to me, seems pretty evident, even though there's some, creativity and experimentation by the big platforms themselves. But at the end of the day, we're going to always have these debates, and we're going to especially have these debates as long as the public perceives the platforms as being relatively opaque in their decision making, in their rulemaking, and in their, on the commercial side, in their advertising and targeting practices and so forth. And I think that, whatever specific approaches each of the platforms undertakes in this space, we're going to have some role for government. And I think that role, first and foremost, to my mind, should be around disclosure and transparency. And, we see this, and maybe Alex will speak to this latest sort of back and forth between Facebook and independent researchers at NYU and the American FTC getting involved. But I think that the lack of transparency is a very big part of the problem and a very big part of the public debate, because we often are operating in this world where the platforms have most of the information, and some of this is changing. I mean, the Facebook Oversight Board is an example of an initiative that may be pushing out some new pressure on transparency. But ultimately, the lack of transparency makes it very hard to have open debate. And I think it works against the companies themselves as well. But having that pressure, I think, will be a big part of the move towards smart regulation in this space, certainly not just in the United States, but around the world.
If I want to talk about this point that I think we've been circling a little bit, this idea that we need more competition, more diversity among the platforms. And I generally agree. I've been thinking about this for a while as the antitrust pressure has been building up, which everyone here knows about. Policymakers saying that there are anti-competition concerns in the major platforms in the US. And I do think that it's important to think about keeping the space open for new startups and new types of platforms and new types of moderation. But I still keep thinking about, the TikTok example, right? More competition doesn't necessarily mean better solutions. I think that competition is important, but we still need to have really strong, sort of globally agreed upon standards. And we have to be comfortable with thinking that those standards may be by themselves slightly biased, right? Biased in favor of, what a certain conception of international human rights law, or a certain conception of a free and open internet. And I think we should be comfortable with that and consider it as sort of the way that a lot of these platforms will be moving forward. Even though it is, of course, very important to think about the local context, I do think that what we keep talking about here are, global norms with local applications. And I think that's key for any solution that we try to think up in the future.
Can I just also plus one that, Tiffany? I absolutely agree with you that competition is not going to solve all problems with social media, and what problems it will solve or may solve, we don't know. To my mind, the reasons that we might want competition are, one, that it may solve some problems. It may mitigate them by making, by reducing, for example, the viral spread of certain kinds of information. And two, perhaps just as importantly, it'll just help us understand better alternative ways of structuring public discourse, because we'll get, we'll have more natural experiments with how different kinds of, principles for what speech to show people and what speech to suppress affect public discourse. And we just don't have a lot of that competition. So we don't have a lot of that data to know. And then, tying that to David's point a minute ago, I also absolutely agree that one of the big problems with this discussion is that it is generally operating without much empirical study. Most of what we know about the platforms and the effects that their algorithmic prioritization of content. And let me just actually make a small side note here. The problems of social media or of network systems are not limited to algorithmic prioritization. WhatsApp does not algorithmically prioritize the speech sent through it. It's a typical messaging program that doesn't do that, and we've seen the kind of viral spread of all sorts of very damaging, harmful information, that has fermented genocide and other terrible abuses. So it's not limited to that, but there's a lot of focus on it for good reason, I think. Algorithmic amplification. But what we know about it is comes mostly from two sources. I would say generally. One is journalists and independent researchers who are able to cobble together some information, largely anecdotal, about how the platforms work and with what effect on public discourse and individuals in society. And second, a fairly limited amount of information that the platforms themselves disclose about their systems. Facebook is a subject of a lot of criticism in this regard, but they get a lot of the criticism in part because they're one of the few companies that actually has, for example, partnered with researchers through like the Social Science One partnership that took place over the last 2 years, which is just to say we should be focusing on a lot of the other platforms which haven't gotten focused just because they haven't taken any steps in this direction, not even the minimal ones, inadequate ones that Facebook has taken. A lot of people in the research community think of this as the YouTube problem. If you just kind of keep your head down in the way that YouTube does, you avoid a lot of public scrutiny by not being particularly transparent about how your algorithmic systems work. But even when there is even though we have some of this information, we have comparatively little. We have very little empirical data on how these systems work. And a big part of the problem is that the platforms themselves shut down research. And David a minute ago was alluding to a conflict that's going on right now between Facebook and two researchers at NYU. And full disclaimer, I'm part of the team of lawyers who represent these researchers in their individual capacities. And these researchers have been studying the spread of disinformation through advertisements, and in particular political advertisements on Facebook's platform. And Facebook for the last almost year has been threatening them with a cease and desist letter claiming that their research violates Facebook's terms of service, even though it involves the collection of very limited anonymous information, no personally identifying information, from consenting Facebook users who donate the information to the research. And that fight became a little bit more public a couple of days ago when Facebook suspended the accounts of the research team in an effort to shut down the research. They claimed that their hands were tied by a consent decree issued by the Federal Trade Commission, which had fined Facebook $5 billion after the Cambridge Analytica scandal. Just about an hour ago, 2 hours ago now maybe, the Federal Trade Commission said that Facebook was wrong to rely on this consent decree in shutting down the research. But these researchers are not the first to have had, to have been threatened by Facebook for doing work in the public interest. Hopefully with this letter from the FTC, they'll be the last. But the point remains that we know very little. We have very little data to go on, and so there's a lot of speculation about what solutions we might try, what effects those solutions might have. Ideally, though, those speculations will be tested, through research and social science, that we just don't have right now.
I think there's one other point that I want to add to this, and that's I think there's a real threat. And this is maybe to go back to the issue of government regulation in this space. As much as the companies bear a lot of responsibility, and we could talk about that, probably each of us could talk about that for hours and hours on end. The government response around the world is also really deeply problematic, and oftentimes designed to put pressure on the platforms, but ultimately to limit debate, to limit criticism of government and officials, to even to criminalize individuals who are tweeting or posting or whatever it is that they're doing. And I think that it's really important for us to be thinking about, what's the response to that? What is the alternative to government, let's say, viewpoint discrimination, like to put it in the mildest terms, right? What's the response to that? What's the alternative to that? And I think that there is some work that's been done, particularly by the organization Article 19, around the idea of what they've called social media councils. And that is something like a press council, which is known in Commonwealth countries and in other parts of the world, but it's sort of a non-governmental approach to dealing with grievance and harms that might be caused by the platforms. And I think, there's a lot of room for creative approaches like that in this space that offer an alternative in the debate to simply thinking of this only as, government has to have a role and government regulation of content is the answer, which I think is going to be problematic, generally speaking, in many parts of the world. And so, particularly in democratic, rule of law oriented countries, it's going to be very important to model what that space, what that regulatory space looks like. And I think creating space for these non-governmental approaches, could be, a tool that's both domestically rewarding in each of those places and brings in some of the local communities into these issues, but also could be, as a kind of outward facing approach, also something to model around the world.
Yeah, I like that idea. I like thinking of non-governmental solutions because I agree that, while of course we need government regulation of speech, every country, every nation has its right to regulate speech of its citizens and so on. It does get a little tricky, right? We see a lot of different governments around the world trying to censor speech online, through the major platforms or otherwise. So it is important to think of solutions that are outside of government. I would just like to, press you a little bit more on what sort of solution would that be? We have a lot of non-governmental forums right now that, sort of softly regulate parts of the internet, setting, standards, communities, and so on. What form could this be? Would you see like a domestic? Would this be an international forum that just has, like, as its purpose, the discussion of social media standards? Is this an association for content moderators? Is it a internet speech standards union or something? Like, what's the sort of format that you envision this working ideally?
Yeah, it's a great question. And the easy answer would be to post in the chat the social media council idea from Article 19, but I'm not going to do that because I think it's a really important point. I mean, there are different. First of all, this is a space that is actually growing. I mean, like you mentioned, an association of content moderators. That's actually happening. Trust and safety is a kind of growing field. So to the extent there are students or early career professionals on this call, I mean, this is a growth field, no doubt about it, and there's going to be a lot of room to do that kind of work. I mean, I think that it could depend. Let me just highlight one of the real serious risks here of something like this, even though it's something I think is worth pursuing. There is a risk of local government capture, right? So if you think about a process that enables local communities to have a kind of a closer access to the companies that have such an impact on their public debate and on their public space, that's a positive. But it's also something that civil society isn't just one thing, and it could be it could be co-opted by government actors, actors with views that aren't necessarily focused on tolerance, whether it's tolerance in kind of the traditional terms, or it's tolerance of freedom of expression and tolerance of privacy and security. So, I recognize that there are some, potential limitations here. But what I imagine, just to give it an example, could be, basically you have multi-stakeholder body. Perhaps it's chartered by government, perhaps it's not, perhaps an international organization can be, taking on a role in chartering something like this, but it's basically multi-stakeholder, and it actually has the ability to take on grievances and complaints from individuals and to issue opinions on those. Now, in a perfect world, those would be binding if the companies agreed to a binding process like that. But whether that could happen immediately, I mean, it's also, frankly, the model of the Facebook oversight board. If you think of something like that, but you make it cross-industry, you make it independent, and you give it binding authority, to me, that's a step in a direction, at least as a matter of figuring out what the route forward is without giving government exclusive authority to make decisions on content. To me, something like that would make sense.
And with that, I do want to move us over to our final questions. Sorry, folks, my laptop decided this would be a good time to install updates. So I'm trying to get back up and running on my computer. But in the meantime, I did want to get us kind of moved over to our last topic for the evening. And to our audience, if you have any questions for our panelists, now would be a great time to go ahead and submit them in the Q&A or in the chat. But our final topic is basically looking at the path forward. How should these content moderation models that we've been discussing be implemented? And who should be held accountable for implementing them?
I think that's part of the discussion we've just been having as well. I mean, I think it's really important to think about a couple of things here. I mean, one is, what are the standards that we're talking about? I think Tiffany has alluded to this, and MLR has alluded to this as well. We're talking about global platforms, and to my mind, we should be looking to global standards of freedom of expression and privacy and other human rights that can guide decision making here. But one of the things that we often leave out in our discussions around what rules should govern are, there's a right to a remedy that should be available to people as well. And the issue of accountability that, Liana, that you're asking, I think should involve not only standards, but also what happens when the companies don't meet those standards. Is it just a kind of, well, we'll do better next time and we apologize, which at least some of the platforms, that's kind of the approach? Or is there some, I want to say cognizable, but we're not necessarily in a legal space, but is there a harm that should be remedied by the companies when we're talking about some of the kinds of issues that we're talking about? I don't know exactly what the answer is to that, but it should be a part of the discussion in addition to standards.
Yeah, I can jump in. I think in terms of the solutions, and yeah, we've already, I think, started discussing that. I think transparency is very important on the way forward. And transparency about what? So transparency and communicating what we are doing as a company. What are we doing as Facebook? Why are we doing it? And seeking external views wherever is possible to strengthen our own content moderation processes. We've talked about the oversight board here and there, and I think the oversight board in itself is accountability in action. And I know, I've read so many thought pieces around it, but I think it's accountability in action. it's a significant check on Facebook's power. So it's a significant check on our power. I think it's also an authoritative way of publicly holding us, or holding Facebook to account for the decisions that we make, and make recommendations on how we can improve our policies, particularly around difficult content decisions that we make as a company. The oversight board in itself, I think, even though it's important for for accountability and all that, it is not a replacement for regulation, and I think we know that, and we continue to call as a company for thoughtful regulation in this space, and I think there's room to do that. In terms of transparency, what we've done early this year, April, May, we launched a transparency center as well, just to share as much as possible around what is changing in our community standards. So the Transparency Center is like a log book. That sounds so archaic, but log book where you can actually check, what are some of the changes that have been going on in our community standards. And I think that's important for transparency, and also probably as a solution for accountability. Who should be held accountable? I think the company itself that's making the decision should be held accountable, and I think there is room for external views in how we arrive at some of the community standards that govern the content on our platforms.
I want to preface what I will be saying next with this. So as Google, we are very much committed to continue to work with policymakers across the world in various contexts to develop and implement appropriate practices and policies. We're putting that at the front. So there's been an increased call that regulation needs to be put in place. There's no doubt that regulation has an important role to play. That in ensuring the platforms and participants in the ecosystem that we are able to continue to protect what is really good about the open web, right? Particularly addressing harm and improving accountability, etc. But there are significant concerns, right, around recent proposals. If we talk about America, some of the removal of safe harbors for intermediaries, for example, to repeal it, that do not or would not serve that objective very well, right? Potentially would actually limit free expression and the ability of platforms like ourselves to be able to take responsible action, because it would be a level of quote unquote abdication. I will reference what I said earlier, the last time I spoke, that the goal should be for transparent, fair, and effective processes. And I believe that Emila has also referenced this, that our ability to be able to be clear, direct, and open about how we take decisions would serve well. All of that said, to again pack it, that regulation is welcome. Working with local governments, working to develop policies and a range of practices that are locally relevant will continue to be one of those ways that we can work with. In terms of your particular proposal, David, should it be an international body? Should it be an extrapolation of what is currently in place? I would say that is a conversation that needs to be able to happen at the appropriate levels. Who would define the makeup of such an institution if it would actually work? What would representation be? What would it reflect in terms of diversity, of taking into into consideration the many nuances that Tiffany has referenced, even Alex has also referenced. So those are some of the things that are on the table. But the core of it for us, with what we currently have, knowing that as we as platforms are innovating, so are those who seek to do harm intentionally or otherwise, also innovating around our innovations, that we consistently have these conversations like this with a willingness to collaborate and speak through what we might see as, I'm trying to look for the word that was used earlier, attempts to obfuscate, to not be clear about how we do things as platforms. And that is not the case. You know, conversations are always welcome. Let's see how we can make it happen. Handing it back.
I just want to double down on something that Titi said, which is a lot of the legislative proposals that you see in the US right now don't seem to be genuine efforts to grapple with the really hard questions that content moderation raises, but instead, you know, efforts to settle partisan political scores. And you know, that's a real shame. Those are not advancing the conversation. You know, in the US anyway, there is going to be a really important constraint on the ability of government to regulate, which is the First Amendment. And so in thinking through the full range of legislative approaches that people might want, you probably would want to think about regulation outside the United States. Inside the United States, I think the kind of regulation that is most likely to you know, survive the inevitable constitutional attacks that you know, will be filed against them are ones that are not connected, you know, are not designed to regulate content moderation directly, but that try to you know, address platforms more generally. And some of the, you know, regulation that I'd like to see, for example, would be privacy regulation. You know, regulation that makes it harder for platforms to monetize personal data in the way that they do right now, or that makes it easier for individuals to take their data elsewhere, which I think is an important barrier right now to the competition that I think, you know, would be nice to see. And you know, there are other forms of kind of antitrust interventions that you can imagine, short of actually breaking up the companies, but just designed to you know, make it harder for them to monopolize the space. Just one other, you know, broader observation. You know, I don't have a strong view on what the right, you know, on David's proposal on what the right approach is for establishing systems of local non-governmental governance of the platforms. But I just have a kind of observation by analogy. You know, really what we're talking about here are two separate versions of free speech. We have a legal version of free speech in the United States. That's the First Amendment. Internationally, it can be a variety of things, including Article 19 of the Internet. I can get this wrong, David. The International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, or you know, and other human rights instruments. But then, and what we're really talking about, you know, in large part today, is a free speech ethos, a culture, an idea that people ought to value open dialogue in free societies. And what the precise contours of this cultural freedom of speech are is very contestable, up for debate. You know, people define it all the time by, you know, articulating themselves the way that they do, by reacting to the speech of others in the way that we do. That's what defines our system of cultural freedom of speech. And, you know, historically, that has not been determined and enforced through centralized power by private institutions. Historically, it has been, you know, determined and enforced by community. You know, if you're in a community, you say what you say, or you don't say what you know, choose not to say, because you may face social sanction, because, you know, you will be ostracized or isolated in your community. And a system of norms, you know, is enforced, you know, through community. And it's a very different, it's an interesting innovation to think about, instead of policing the kind of cultural freedom of speech through community interactions, to instead police it through, police is the wrong word, but to try to establish it through a slightly more centralized system of governance. And it's, you know, one question that I have, I suppose, is, will it prove necessary in the long run? You know, the current configuration of the social media platforms is by no means inevitable. You know, they certainly have enormous power, and there are barriers to entry that make it very hard to displace them. But Facebook is 15 years old now. You know, the first iPhone came out in 2006, I think. I don't, I may be getting that wrong, off by a couple of years, but you know, the current technology landscape is by no means inevitable. And it may be that we don't actually have to eventually institute formal systems of governance of digital speech, because what we have today may ultimately fall apart and leave in its wake a system that looks a little bit more like Wikimedia, where we create online the same forms of standards and norm development that we have offline, namely this cultural freedom of speech that emerges from a collective ethos of open dialogue. Maybe that is a terribly naive expectation. You know, it may be that the kind of digital transformation we've seen is just not going to be compatible with this kind of idealized version of kind of community interaction. But at least to my mind, what we have right now is not inevitable, and the solutions that we're imagining, for them right now may not be necessary. But I don't know. Others on this call have a much broader understanding of free speech development around the world than I do, and so I'd love to hear from others.
Unfortunately, we are running short on time, and so with an eye towards our Q&A, I'm going to go ahead and pause the conversation here, because what better place to end it on than perhaps the whole internet should be a little bit more like Wikipedia. So I do have a few questions for our moderators. Sorry if we're not able to get to all of the questions. We had a number of really great, interesting questions posed. We might not be able to get to all of them, so I'll ask our panelists to kind of keep your responses brief, but I will go ahead and pose them to you all. So our first question is, how does coverage by traditional media on the social media posts of public figures impact content moderation strategies? And how do different content moderation strategies affect the experiences and expectations of subscribers of politicians?
Do you mind repeating it? I didn't get
Sorry,
it.
it is kind of lengthy and it is a couple of parts. So how does coverage by traditional media of the social media posts of public figures impact content moderation strategies? Maybe we'll stick with just the first part for now.
So I want to mention that I think that's a great question. We talk about social media content moderation all the time. But for example, in the US, I'm sure someone has a number. There are only, how many stations around the country are all owned by the same, like 3 companies or something? It's not a very diverse set of companies that owns major media right now. Local newspapers are dying, all of that, right? So we talk about social media all the time, but if there are only so many places where you can read the news or listen to the radio, if you still listen to the radio, that's a much more problematic conversation to me than saying, oh, well, I can't see something on Facebook, or something's being overly amplified on Twitter. Because although all of us are online, some of us are very, very online, the vast majority, I would say, of the world are not like that, right? And many people, don't even use the internet in the same way we do as a part of their daily life. So I do think that the media coverage of, say, Trump's terrible posts and so on, often can amplify the message more than his actual post. And if we talk about moderating content on social media and international speech governance norms, we should also think about the speech governance norms of traditional media and traditional sources of information.
I would also quickly jump in on the media, how media plays out, for content moderation. I would go back to the point that I made about content moderation not just being one thing. So at Facebook, we look at it as 3 things. So it's not just the end, the enforcement, but also starting from the content policy development itself. So I'm in that team, and I do read the articles, media. I do read David Kay's book around policing. You know the title better, but so we read that as well as we develop our content policies, because we are not the experts, right? So we take inspiration from some of the experts that we read from, some of even the Wikimedia fellows who are in this call. Then there's that integrity piece where there's the tools and the AI and the algorithms. And then there's the global ops. So the global ops are the human reviewers of content. And for some items, they would need local context, and where do you get that local context? Sometimes from reading and from talking to our local public policy experts as well. I think we should not think of the digital world as a separate world and the offline world as a separate world, where you make decisions in this online world without the context of where you are at. I hope that answers that question.
Yeah, I think so. And so that kind of brings us to the second half of that question, which is for people who have subscribed to or followed politicians on social media, how do these different content moderation strategies affect the experiences of those people who are trying to follow politicians on social media?
It's a bit of a convoluted one to respond to, but in connection with the earlier question, the earlier half of the question as well, is very briefly high quality content, authoritative sources, quote unquote fact checking. Those are some of the ways that currently you're able to approach it. Is it perfect? No, it's a work in progress, but it's certainly one that has demonstrated that content, even from quote unquote political sources, political figures, can definitely be reviewed in ways that if it lands at actual removal, if it needs to happen, it also happens. So high quality content, authoritative sources consistently, having a consistent high standard of quality, looking at reliability of the publishers or the sources themselves, all are things that play into it.
The only thing I would add is, I think if I'm understanding the question correctly, it's really observing that there is sometimes a tension between a platform's desire to moderate speech and users of that platform's interest in seeing that speech. And I think that's inevitable. If you have a content moderation policy, it will inevitably conflict with the interests of some users who will nonetheless want to see that speech. And that's ultimately the prerogative of the platforms to decide what kind of speech they want to prioritize and amplify and make available on their platforms. And you might think that one answer to the problem of the disconnect is the availability of other places for those listeners or speakers to go. Or you might think, if the speech is sufficiently harmful, that there should be no alternative to be able to get access to that speech. But to my mind, it'd be nice to have more, not less diversity, so there is less centralized control of the speech environment. But that's not really our current landscape.
All right, so the next question that we have, I think this is somewhat informed by the recent online safety bills that have been proposed in Australia and in the United Kingdom. How should platforms address content moderation issues when social pressures or even legal pressures define harmful content in ways that are so broad that it could possibly require platforms to also take down information that's important or even helpful? How do we deal with that overbreadth in policy drafting?
I'll take a shot at or stab at that first. But the UK proposal, Australian law, the German NetzDG, Network Enforcement Act, different proposals, and new law adopted in France. I mean, all of this law includes within it, or proposals, particularly as they focus on what they call harmful content, a real significant amount of uncertainty as to definitions, a real lack of clarity. And I think we can expect that lack of clarity to result in a couple of different things, one of which is that the companies are likely to respond to those new rules by being safe and taking down more content then is maybe necessitated by a particular rule, but because the rule itself isn't very clear, they're going to need, they're going to have, their legal team saying, look, we need to avoid liability, so you should take down this content, even though maybe it's on the border, right? So I think that's a problem, and I think that both companies and civil society should be pushing in those contexts for a role for their, for their judiciaries, for independent courts and tribunals to have a role, rather than essentially giving the companies this massive power to make these decisions about what is and is not legitimate speech as a matter of public law, which is essentially what these rules often are moving towards. So I think there's a real role for the companies to play and for civil society to play in pushing back against those kinds of things, and also to articulate how these rules model really bad behavior in places that don't necessarily have the kind of rule of law system that you see in the countries that we've just talked about.
Well, and then finally, we have one more question. Thank you to everyone who submitted questions. I'm sorry we couldn't get to all of them. Each of these, I think, could become their own panel in and of itself. But I just wanted to end on maybe a little bit of a fun note. So one of our audience members says, I'm a recent graduate looking to go into content moderation, internet and data privacy, and data ethics. What do you recommend I do to start getting into the fields?
First of all, I would say it's too broad. So content moderation, I'm just thinking at how, I'm thinking from a Facebook perspective where it's like 6 or 7 teams. Just thinking, I think, the person who put through that question, I think, what are their interests? Like, what is it that they really want to do? And focus on that. And I think the good thing about working in, at Facebook or in one of these tech companies is that there are different pockets of everything, I think, in what you're going to do. So I join a team that that you really feel like you contribute the most, whether it's technical or policy. I'm in the policy team, and I like it that because you work with cross-functional teams as well, and there's so many levels that you can get into, either at entry level or even student fellowships and all that, and make a difference at what level that you get into.
I certainly am happy to chip in on this one. Here's the key. I've been doing this for about 20 years now. And it started with somebody actually telling me I didn't know how to use a device. That was my entry into this world. I've been a policy wonk for 20 years. And how did I get there? From realizing that there was a major gap in terms of how government was responding to emerging technologies. And I made it my life's mission, I should say, on enabling different sectors and being able to respond and shape that. So the first thing is you need to be able to get clarity on what it is you want to be able to do. You have listed quite a number of those things there, but don't limit yourself to just one. Be willing to be able to learn. And like Emila has said, my first degree is in English. I'm working for Google. Sincerely, it could really play out in many ways. Happy to have an ongoing conversation with you. If you reach out to the organizers, happy to be able to have that conversation with you on a different scale. That's it.
Yeah, I would also echo that. Just definitely don't feel limited by what you've been studying. I was also an English major in undergrad. All of us on this call, I think, are working in either law or policy. So if that's something that interests you, well, try to maybe get a law or policy degree. But even if you don't, you can get internships, start your way, get your foot in the door. My tech law career started at Wikimedia when I was a summer fellow during law school. So very exciting. And I just kept going with it, right? I took the classes, I did the internship, post-grad fellowship, I worked in the industry. And that's just kind of how you have to try to structure your career. But also structuring your career is kind of a misnomer. follow your passion, see where it takes you. My one concrete tip is to talk to as many people as you can. So people, on this panel, for example, professors, even just searching LinkedIn for people who are doing jobs you think are cool. Shoot them a message, ask to talk to them for about 20 minutes, hear about how they got to where they are. It's what I did during law school, and it's what I recommend to everybody who's trying to figure out how to really get started in the field.
And I have one last thing that you can do if you are a current law student or a recent graduate with a passion for freedom of expression and sharing free knowledge with the world. Apply to Wikimedia's fellowship program. We hire about 3 times a year. Our fall fellowships have just finished recruiting, but we're going to be hiring for spring 2022. That's going to open up in about 2 months. So be sure to keep an eye on jobs.wikimedia.org if you think it could be fun to come and join us. So I want to offer a huge thank you to all of our panelists. This has been such a rich, interesting discussion. I'm certainly going to be thinking about the things that we discussed here for several days and weeks ahead. Thank you to our whole audience for attending this panel. It's been great to get your feedback in the chat, your informed, interesting questions that have come in. And finally, I want to offer a huge thank you to our summer fellows, David Afahame, Mary Bagdasarian, Lisa Chen, and George Chen, who organized this whole thing. And I think it's been wonderful to have you all here as we gathered this brilliant group for this conversation. So thank you all so much for being here, and hope to see you all again before too terribly long.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much.
Thanks all.
Thanks, everybody.